Assalamu alaikum. Does tonsillectomy increase or decrease deep neck space infections risk? The question is basic, but for answering such a very basic question, we have to review two sets of opposing data. Big sets of data with tens of thousands of patients from different parts of the world, England, Scotland, Taiwan, and Korea, that carries what may appear as inconsistent results. In 2021, a report on tonsillitis, tonsillectomy, and deep neck space infections in England was published in the Annals of the Royal College of Surgeons of England. It noted that tonsillectomy is a common surgical procedure performed chiefly for recurrent tonsillitis. Almost 50,000 operations were performed in England in 2017. The Scottish Intercollegiate Guidance Network (SIGN) introduced the guidelines in 1998 to improve selection for tonsillectomy. The aim was to reduce the potential harm of patients from surgical complications such as hemorrhage if the surgery is not really indicated. Since the introduction of the guidance, the number of admissions for tonsillitis and its complications has increased dramatically. Analysis of the National Hospital episode statistics in the UK over a 20 years period since the SIGN guidance was introduced showed that the incidence of deep neck space infection has increased almost five times, mediastinitis 10 times, peritonsillar abscess by 1.7 folds, compared with the period just prior to the SIGN guidance. A further development came in 2011 with the implementation of procedures of limited clinical value. This came from a group that was commissioned to advise on rationing and restricting surgical procedures of limited clinical value, including tonsillectomy. The incidence of deep neck space infection increased further 2.4 times, mediastinitis 4 times, peritonsillar abscess 1.4 times, compared with immediately prior to the clinical commission group rationing. So the rate of tonsillectomy and the associated procedures to arrest primary hemorrhage, which happens in about 1 to 2% of the cases, had remained relatively constant over 17 years period, with 46,000 in 1999 and up to 49,000 in 2016, despite an increase in the population of England by 7 million over the same period. The significant rise in admissions for tonsillitis and its complications came with a heavy price. Prior to the introduction of the SIGN guidelines, the cost for treating tonsillitis and its complications was estimated in the area of 8 million per year. In 2017, this jumped to £73 million. The cost of tonsillectomy prior to the introduction of the SIGN guidelines was 71 million, but that dropped to 56 million only after introduction of the SIGN guidelines and the clinical commissioning group rationing for tonsillectomy. In 2018, University of Birmingham study group had studied retrospectively the figures for tonsillectomy in children and found that the UK performs half as many tonsillectomies as other nations in Europe, including Belgium and Norway. There is good evidence that quality of life studies had showed improved quality of life for patients suffering from recurrent sore throats after surgery compared to those who did not undergo surgery. Concerns that the current approach for selecting patients for tonsillectomy is incorrectly set against tonsillectomy have been voiced by the Royal College of Surgeons of England. A peritonsillar abscess, a quinsy, can progress to a deep neck space infection and or mediastinitis in about 1.8% of the cases. The deep neck space infection on its turn can progress to mediastinitis in about 10% of the cases, and the mortality from mediastinitis, although variable, may be in excess of 30%. Peritonsillar abscesses after tonsillectomy are very uncommon. A systematic review suggests that there are as few as 11 reported cases of peritonsillar abscesses after tonsillectomy. Tonsillectomy appears to be a useful intervention with regard to preventing peritonsillar abscess. New trends in the incidence of tonsillitis and deep neck space infections has been observed. You would see the tonsillitis and its complications rates in this chart, tonsillitis with the red line and the complications of the neck space infections with the blue line. The tonsillitis incidence is now bimodal. It rises sharply in the very young, but also has another peak in the adults. This could be accounted for by non-operative management at an earlier age. And this would also explain the rise in the deep neck space infections in the same age group, corresponding to the other peak of adult tonsillitis in here. You would see in this chart the significant rise in hospital admissions for peritonsillar abscesses over the 20 years period from 1998 to 2017. You would see here the landmarks for the introduction of the SIGN guideline 34, the SIGN guideline 117, and the procedures of limited clinical value in 2011. And as you see, the chart has indicated a rise from almost 6,000 admissions to more than 10,000 admissions for peritonsillar abscess over the 20 years period. This chart would illustrate the much more significant rise in the incidence of deep neck space infections over the same period, over the same 20 years period. You would see the very significant rise in the mediastinitis, other neck space infection abscesses, retropharyngeal and parapharyngeal abscesses, and the collective deep neck space infections, which have risen from just below 200 cases to just below 1,000 cases per year in a 20 years period. The effects of reducing tonsillectomies was a fourfold increase in the admissions for tonsillitis, 69% increase in the bed days for the same period. Admissions doubled for peritonsillar abscesses, increased 5 times for deep neck space infection, excluding mediastinitis, and for mediastinitis alone, it increased 10 times. Generally speaking, while the bed days have reduced for tonsillectomy, any gain in bed space has been offset by admission for tonsillitis and its complications. I would now move to the other side of the argument, again using very big data sets, starting with this report from Taiwan with a cohort of more than 100,000 patients, published in 2015. The retrospective cohort was comparing the incidence of deep neck space infections in 2 groups of patients, a group who had tonsillectomy, about 10,000, and a much larger group who did not, about 100,000. In the tonsillectomy group, they had 34 deep neck space infections in the 10,000 cases, accounting to about 0.34%. On the control group, there was 174 deep neck space infections. In the much larger cohort, almost 10 times, the percentage was much lower, almost half, at 0.17%. After correcting the two groups for demographics, the absolute risk of deep neck space infection was 1.7 times higher in patients who had tonsillectomy. This was a retrospective study, and you may wonder whether matching between the two groups was ideal or not. For example, patients in the tonsillectomy cohort should be expected to have a much higher chance of having a recurrent tonsillitis. That's why they had had the operation in the first instance compared with the control cohort. This may have predisposed them to a higher risk of future deep neck space infections. The other point was that most of the deep neck space infections were in adult patients below the age of 40, compared to pediatric patients who have much less higher rates of deep neck space infections. This may suggest that non-operative management of recurrent tonsillitis in childhood may predispose to deep neck space infections in adulthood. In addition, the pediatric patients who had obstructive sleep apnea and had tonsillectomy because of that did not have a significantly higher risk of deep neck space infections. It's only in the patients who had had recurrent tonsillitis, like 5 or more episodes of tonsillitis per year, who had a significant increase in the deep neck space infection even after surgery. This large Taiwanese study demonstrates the experience in a country that did not use the SIGN criteria or the Paradise criteria for selecting patients for tonsillectomy. The increased risk of deep neck space infection despite tonsillectomy with 5 or more episodes of tonsillitis may be suggesting that the current arbitrarily defined criteria of 7 or more episodes in a year, 5 or more episodes in 2 years, may be too restrictive. And then came a big data report from South Korea on 26,000 patients that suggests that the risk of retropharyngeal and parapharyngeal abscesses in adults increases after tonsillectomy in adults, but not in children. Kim et al. Had compared the rate of deep neck space infections in patients who had had tonsillectomy, more than 5,000 patients, with those who did not, about 21,000 patients. Those who had surgery for suspected or confirmed malignancy were excluded from the analysis, and patients who had had previous deep neck space infections were also excluded. Then he tried to match the patients for demographic data, including the frequency of prior upper respiratory tract infections. The mean was just more than 5 episodes of infections in a year. And now, even after adjusting for the rate of recurrent infections between the operative and the non-operative groups, the hazard ratio for developing deep neck space infection after tonsillectomy was 1.87 in adults and adolescents, and this was highly significant. But in children, this was insignificant. The time between developing deep neck space infection and having the operation was about 4 years or so, 53 months. Patients were not subdivided by indication of surgery for recurrent tonsillitis or obstructive sleep apnea like the Wang et al. Study. And then came a report from Western Scotland in 2018, which showed that the most common origin of infections, of deep neck space infections, were still the tonsillar infections, closely followed by dental infections at 37.8, so very close. 5% of the patients who had deep neck space infections had tonsillectomy performed in the past. Treating deep neck space infections is difficult and expensive. Hurley showed that the mean length of stay in hospital was about 11 days and that 27% of the patients required ICU admissions, 28% required HDU admissions, and 21% required both the ICU and the high dependency unit admissions. Admitted patients would have already been started on antibiotics, about 70% of them. The paropharyngeal abscess is the commonest deep neck space infection at about 60%. 12% of the patients had evidence of multiple abscesses in the neck rather than just a single site, and about 14.8% of them had more than one surgical procedure. The large data sets from Taiwan and Korea demonstrated an increased risk of deep neck space infections after tonsillectomy if the patient had more than 5 previous episodes of tonsillitis. The data don't support adult tonsillectomy as preventive of deep neck space infections in those patients who had had recurrent tonsillitis already. But it suggests that the pediatric tonsillectomy for recurrent tonsillitis has no increased risk of deep neck space infection. When patients on the pediatric group were followed up for 10 years post-tonsillectomy, there was no increased risk of deep neck space infections. More favorable results in the pediatric group is supported by another study which showed in a long cohort of more than 6 years of follow-up that sore throat consultation rates in children who had had the tonsillectomy is much less compared to those who did not have the surgery, suggesting that the tonsillectomy was of benefit in the pediatric population. And now back to the starting point. Is there a link between tonsillectomy and deep neck space infections risk? And if there is it a cause and effect relationship or just an association? When looking at the big data from Taiwan and Korea, there is an apparent link between tonsillectomy and increased deep neck space infections after the operation. But is it the tonsillectomy operation, or rather the reasons why the tonsillectomy was performed in the first instance, that is to say, the recurrent infections that caused the patient to have the surgery? On the other hand, in the UK, the establishing of increased number of deep neck space infections after restricting tonsillectomy cannot be definitively attributed to the restriction. There may be other reasons. More research in this area could support or refute a change in the tonsillectomy criteria at the moment for recurrent infections of tonsillitis. By this, we come to the end of this presentation on does tonsillectomy increase or decrease the risk of developing deep neck space infections. Assalamu alaikum.